Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello, this episode of the Human Risk podcast is a little different to the normal format. It's the recording of a webinar that I did with Dr. Roger Miles a couple of weeks ago. If you're a long-standing listener to the podcast, you'll have heard a previous discussion I had with Roger in episode 6 of this series. I'll remind you of that number at the end, so you can go back after this and take a listen. The subject of our webinar was conduct and culture under COVID. In our discussion, Roger and I explore what changes, if any, there have been during Coronatime to expectations and norms of what constitutes good behaviour. Many industries are now regulated by behavioural or conduct regulators who have views on what they expect from their regulatees. Equally, we're seeing a shift in societal expectations as to what the general public expects from companies, either the ones they work for or from whom they buy products. Roger and I explore what that means and how we, both companies and individuals, can best respond to the changing dynamics. As ever with the webinar recordings, the quality isn't as high because of the limitations of Zoom, so apologies for that. But hopefully lower quality audio is compensated for by high quality content. Welcome to everybody to this webinar on conduct under COVID. My co-presenter Roger Miles has had a slight challenge in that his internet connection isn't functioning, so he is joining by phone. So the first thing I will do is to say, Roger, can you hear us?
I can indeed, Christian. Thank you very much for having me, and I hope whatever you're looking at on screen isn't too off-putting.
So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Christian Hunt. I head Human Risk, which is a behavioural science-led consultancy and training firm specialising in the deployment of behavioural science in the fields of risk, compliance, conduct and ethics. And I will allow my co-presenter, Dr. Roger Miles, to present himself to you shortly, and then we will kick off with our topic. The objective of today is really to explore the changes around conduct in the current environment, if indeed there are any. We want this to be an interactive session, so you have the ability through the Q&A tab to ask questions or make comments. I would encourage you to do that, and we will look to answer those as we go throughout the session. With all of that said, let me hand over to Roger to introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Christian. So my name is Roger Miles. I work in behavioural research, which the meaning of which will become a bit clear as we go on through this. I originally trained as an accountant. I then worked in the city in investor relations and banking, and did a tour in Whitehall looking after risk communications. Really all of that was a prelude, though, to my changing courses in the early noughties to be a research academic, looking at why the design of laws and regulations and controls often doesn't work because people don't do what you want them to do. So a badly designed control often triggers misbehavior. So I did a couple of research pieces on that, and then came back into mainly working in the financial sector now, looking at this thing called conduct regulation, and that is part of what we're going to be enlightening you on a little bit today. Those of you not familiar with what that means, don't worry, we'll talk about it with some examples later. But my main job is putting into plain language the complexities of behavioural science and banking law, and helping people to be the best they can be ethically in how they conduct themselves with fellow staff and customers in banking spaces. But all of that will make a little bit more sense as we go through the next 3/4 of an hour or so. Thanks, Christian.
Excellent. I think, Roger, it would be helpful, and let's turn straight onto that topic that you raised in your introduction. My guess is that most people who have signed up for a conduct presentation will have some idea what it is, but I think it would be helpful for us to just start off by having you give us one of your plain language definitions of that. Can you just give us a quick summary as to what do you mean and understand by the word conduct?
Yeah, let me try and approach this kind of sideways in a way that will become clearer as we go. So conduct is seeking to explain why what actually happens, what people actually do, very often is not the same as what the controls or the laws say they should be doing. So ever since Robert Merton published a paper back in the 1930s called Unintended Consequences, it's been clear to lawmakers and rule makers that simply telling people to do things doesn't mean they actually do them. Quite often they'll do the exact opposite. or they'll use the framework of the law to create kind of elaborate game for, mis-selling financial products or pulling the wool over people's eyes, or whatever. So in the modern world, what we're doing is using behavioural science, particularly psychology of decision-making, to redesign laws and regulations and controls to make them more commonly followed, as it were. So to make sure that people actually want to do what they're being told to do, and that they're not feeling that the law is kind of compelling them against their will very often. In financial services, I probably don't need to dwell on this. There's been a history of misbehaviour of all kinds, some of it local, some of it, frankly, systemic. And the regulations changed abruptly in around 2013 when we introduced a new thing called the Financial Conduct Authority. That is the UK's main financial regulator, for our purposes at least. And the clue is in the title. The word conduct means this is a regulator who deeply cares about the behaviour of financial firms, both among colleagues in the workplace and, more importantly, perhaps, with customers and clients out in the market. Previously, financial regulation was all based around sort of econometric controls and contract law and a thing called value at risk, which was very much about the money and not very much about the people. So in plain terms, the controls now are about how people behave with each other and when they are client-facing, and rather less about the fine detail of contract structures, laws, and risk evaluation in monetary terms, if that makes sense.
I think that makes perfect sense. So just to reiterate to the people who have joined lately, I know we've had one comment saying, I can see Christian, but I can't see Roger. There is nothing wrong with your connection. Unfortunately, you then get a full screen version of me because Roger's internet connection is currently not permitting him to dial in. He will join visually as soon as that's possible. We have him on the line to ensure that we can have that. Once again, if you have any questions or thoughts, please feel free to use the Q&A bar on the screen. So, Roger, you've explained sort of the rationale what conduct is, but if we sort of explore why is it important, and you mentioned the UK's Financial Conduct Authority. There are other regulators with a conduct remit, either a sole conduct remit or as part of a broader financial services, but also another industry remit. Why does this matter? What is the sort of societal drive behind having conduct regulation? And why is it such a concern for people that it's necessary to have regulation and regulators focusing on it?
You make the very reasonable point that actually conduct rules have been with us for centuries. If, for example, you're a medic or a person in uniform, particularly the military, you will be well aware that you have conduct regulation. And essentially it's around what we now call social purpose or useful behaviour. In other words, as you go about your work, that you are not doing something which is harmful to wider society. So good conduct in financial services means an awareness, among other things, that we're not simply in the business of selling products, but actually we're in the business of money transmission, helping cash to flow through the economy. Rather, as we've seen with COVID, and I know we'll come back to this later, suddenly it becomes exceedingly clear that the function of the banking system is to make sure that people have access to cash when times are difficult. And if need be, extra cash to keep businesses afloat while their lines of credit are being stretched. So the purpose of conduct controls is really to make sure that people behave in a positive, ethical way, that they show, moral courage, that there are healthy workplace cultures, and in the case of finance particularly, that senior managers are seen to take personal responsibility for ethical behaviour. One of the things that behavioural psychology teaches us is that where you have, as it were, a human face attached to an issue, people can hold a person accountable much more directly than they can hold a sort of nebulous organisation or structure of something accountable. So the new rules are saying very much, you put a face on the management. It is literally a person ultimately responsible for a thing. And through a legal process called attestation, or the senior manager's regime, those people who are responsible for running stuff have to write literally a personal letter to the regulator each year saying, I understand that I am ultimately responsible, the buck stops here. Many people might say, why on earth didn't that happen ages ago? Well, as I said a second ago, because the law really was framing controls in finance very much around the products and the contracts, and not really paying very much attention to the people, which you'd think is odd. In this sense, it's, as I say, not new. We've had conduct regulation in other sectors, and we've also had behavioural science applied to the framing of rules for years and years and years. If you go and talk to anyone in Holland or parts of the US or in Israel, for example, they've been framing rules and controls using behavioural research for 30 years or more. Actually, the UK is relatively late to the party, albeit that we have one of the world's first financial conduct regulators.
And I think what's interesting there is you've rightly pointed out that there is, financial services is now concentrating on this topic, but clearly this idea that the way that we do things matters significantly has been around for a long, long, long time. And we can go back to religious scriptures, for example, and see similar things where there are requirements in there that go to the quality of how you behave and the way that you do something. So this idea that this is a new fad is the word might seem like a relatively new piece, but the concept that we care not just about the outcome, but how it has been delivered is something that's been around for some time.
Yes, and I think what we're seeing now with the health emergency now is that everyone is far more focused on the underlying sort of rationale of what these rules are about. So, as you know, some of our colleagues in the research community said, COVID is a sort of massive behavioural experiment in seeing how big organisations adapt to being challenged by broadly the general public, but also, customers as people trying to get on with their lives at a time when access to services and, finance and the food supply and so on is being put under severe pressure. Now, what's striking to me is that this sort of regulatory approach that we're seeing in finance is also now being looked at by other regulators over the fence. Our friend Chris Hodges, who I think you're going to be interviewing soon, has done a really interesting piece of work looking at how all the different sectors which use a conduct approach are learning from each other. So we actually have a conduct approach in the food supply in the UK, for example. And some people might be startled to hear that the utility companies, so the power, electric power and gas and so on companies, are beginning to do social profiling of their customers in order to see how they can behave better and meet expectations. So some of the older conduct regulated professional sectors are also doing this, by the way. So lawyers have started using behavioural principles to review some of their own practices, where, for example, lawyers have been in the past very happy to slap injunctions on inconvenient, whistleblowers coming out of the corporate side. It is now seen as an abuse of the law to suppress, a fair expression of conscience or whistleblowing. And so even quite conventional areas which have had professional conduct rules are now changing their behaviour in response to this sense that there's social pressure to behave yourself better, to be more transparent, for your ethics really to drill right down through the organisation, rather than being something that's just talked about in a board committee on governance, which is where it tended to live before. And that doesn't sort of put a lot of very practical points out there in terms of what's going on now. Perhaps, Christian, we might talk about how it plays out in practice. And just give me a minute, because I think my line's back on. I'm just going to try and connect.
Excellent. And I'll sort of hold the fort, Roger, while we see if we can get you on board visually. But I think one of the interesting things that strikes is that clearly there are plenty of regulations out there that are set by official authorities that we recognize the need for, but we might not have an understanding of ourselves. So in the banking industry, there is this idea of having capital. Everybody appreciates the fact that you need a safety blanket within that industry for, if you like, a rainy day or a problematic time, that the bank has some resources to be able to lean on should it incur excessive amount of losses. We recognize the idea of airline safety and the requirements that are there. But we're not necessarily aware of the detail of how that's calculated or the rules that underpin it. Conduct is slightly different in that I think every single person has legitimately a view on what good and bad conduct is. And so what we're looking at when we look at conduct regulation and conduct in general is something that the person in the street can understand conceptually and can legitimately have a view on. And that makes it a slightly different dynamic to more traditional forms of regulation where you might recognize the need for it, but you won't necessarily be fully versed in the detail of how the rule is arrived at. Conduct is very easy for people to assess because it is all about ultimately protecting individuals, and individuals will have views on how they were treated and whether or not they were protected. So there's an interesting piece here, which is, I think, bringing regulation much more closely aligned to the perception that people have that wouldn't exist in certain other types of regulation. And that makes it very, very complicated because it becomes a matter of perception. Airline safety becomes a matter of fact as to whether anything went wrong. Conduct starts to become a matter of perception, and therefore is, one, challenging from a regulatory perspective, but I think two, means that people having to respond to conduct need to be thinking of it much more in flexible, fluid terms, because perception is obviously something that can change over time. And I see Roger hasn't joined us by video, but I will try and see if I can bring him into the conversation.
The progress bar is going round and round. So let me just put an extra couple of thoughts in there. And to your question, how do we define what is good or bad conduct? Answer, it's really difficult because it's a moving target. And one of the basic questions we wrestle with in behavioural analysis sometimes is which way is up? What represents good or appropriate behaviour? And just to take an example from banking, which won't get a lot of sympathy, but to think about this, is it better that a bank forecloses on a company that's losing money and racking up huge debts, or kind of steps in to bail it out, even though it might be, what the politicians call a zombie business, a business which shouldn't really be able to thrive because the market isn't able to support what it's doing? So, the challenge that bankers face, and they don't get a lot of sympathy for it, in a sense, why should they, is whether to pull the plug on a business that's going under or kind of throw good money after it and extend loans further. Is it good behaviour to support a business which isn't actually solvent and has no prospects of recovering, or is it better for the bank to cut its losses? Now, these things there's a moral dimension to that, obviously, the business dimension to that. But actually, if you look at the social dimension, it's not always clear what good behaviour is either, because it changes. One of the questions I ask in workshops to people is your idea of a good night out now, your idea of a good party, the same as it was when you were 17 years old? Because for a lot of people, it's not. It's called growing up. We actually change our idea of what good behaviour or the right kind of social conduct is as we get older and more responsible. And there's a wonderful scientist called Howard Becker who was working back in the 50s and 60s. Coincidentally a jazz musician and, legalized cannabis fan. And he was saying what is acceptable behavior is very much down to how society labels it. And if you think about it, the kind of pejorative names for minority groups or homosexuality or whatever, these things, we've moved on a great deal in our use of language around accepting people, with social differences. One of the things that Becker also challenges is this idea of being a bystander. Are you somebody who stands around and watches other people being abusive to each other, or do you step up and challenge the way that they, use abusive labels as a way of distancing people and creating out groups? There's a lot of work now done on this bystander area of, how often is bad behaviour the product of good people doing nothing? And again, some of you will recognise, I'm sure that goes all the way back to the Nuremberg trials and beyond. This idea that moral courage is more than a matter of just sort of standing by. You have to step up and show the best of yourself. And that really, Christian, is where the COVID challenge comes in. We've had this so-called abrupt and brutal challenge where every provider of pretty much anything is having to reconsider its priorities away from simply making money towards a wider sense of social good. And some have done really well with this, others not so much.
And Roger, we've had our first question, for which thank you, Greg. And his question is: should conduct regimes be principles or rule based? And I think that goes to the heart of what you've just been talking about, which is to say it is a movable feast, dynamics shift. So how should regulators best manage it? How do they, particularly financial services, given the focus on it, how do they think about that? Is it rules-based or is it principles-based? And what are the implications for that in terms of this dynamic that you've just described?
Yeah, I think a lot of this is down to how society frames things that are going to... One of the things I've been reading recently in the long afternoons of lockdown is a piece around leadership and the quality of leadership. But our own financial regulator is extremely interested in the qualities of good leaders. At the moment, they've been referring to a thing called the IVEY, Business School Model of Leadership, which I dug into a bit. I thought this looks familiar. And sure enough, it goes back to Socrates, it's sort of 2,500 years old, all about the virtues of leadership. One thing we look at in behavioural modelling is try not to make things into simple tick boxes. Try to create a scale of what is better or worse, what is further up or further down the scale. And one of the things that the ancient Greeks did rather well was looking at, if you take the name of a characteristic or virtue, as they called it, and you kind of slide the slider up and down, you can see a point at which you have too much or too little something. So to take an example I just mentioned, courage, the idea you need to be courageous to step up when there's a challenge. There is such a thing as too little courage, which is, sort of bystanding or cowardice, if you want to call it that. But there's also such a thing as too much courage, which you or I, Christian, would call being stupid, jumping into a space where you have no prospect of actually making a difference to something. So somebody who goes on a sort of suicide mission to capture the fortress, as it were, isn't actually being necessarily a helpful participant in the situation. Somebody kind of rushing off headlong to try and fix something which they have no prospect of fixing is not exercising courage in a useful way. So we need to consider types of behaviour which are useful and the situations in which they're useful and when they're not. The other thing we're looking at around this behavioural model is a piece called Behavioural lens, which we've discussed, Christian, a few times. And that's where you've got a big external pressure situation, as we have with COVID. The extent to which ordinary people, those who are not involved in decision-making, will put up with what's going on around them, whether they regard the conduct of, in this case, government, and indeed the healthcare and the science behind it, whether they regard all of that as acceptable. And it's seen that there are a series of triggers or thresholds which, if you step over them, they trigger a sense in the public mind that this is not acceptable behaviour. So just to take one as an example, the load factor. So forcing people to do an activity which they don't want to do. Rather obviously in the case of lockdown, there are maybe for some people some benefits of lockdown. For most people it's a bit of a pain. It's restricting their preferences. So to what extent do people put up with the load on the understanding that there's some trade-off at the end of it? In the case of COVID, it's the benefit of knowing that fewer people are going to die, that the health service isn't going to blow up, and that actually we'll all be, on balance, most of us will be generally better for having lived through lockdown rather than continuing our normal social life. So we sort of accept the trade-off for as long as the load is not seen as unreasonable. But actually, I talked about moving targets earlier. The moving target is still moving, and the longer we go into lockdown, the closer that threshold approaches that people say, do you know what? Actually, no, the trade-off is not okay anymore. So with behavioural lens, we look at factors like load, physical dread or existential dread, psychological safety, a sense of innate fairness, just simple human natural justice and fairness. And finally, this thing called social proof, which is a behavioural jargon phrase for, am I okay behaving this way when I check with my friends and family and my neighbours and see, do they agree with me or do they disagree? Should I change my behaviour because nobody that I know is going to behave like this anymore? And so again, with something like lockdown, you have to have policing by consent. You have to have compliance by consent, the sense that people are looking around friends, family, work colleagues or whatever saying, yeah, we're kind of okay with this. But that's a very volatile trigger. And it doesn't take a lot for people to start looking around at, for example, police reports of, hill walkers being chased with drones and photographed. But people say, hang on a minute, that's really not okay. That's not part of the deal here. We don't think it's all right for you to harass citizens as they go about what we thought was a legitimate activity. So these trip thresholds, if we can call them that, are constantly moving and redefining as defined by society, by conversations between people, friends, neighbours, and so on. And good and bad conduct is similarly not a fixed point. It's socially defined, and it's really hard to set that definition, in particular if you don't kind of look beyond your own organisation, your own firm, your own institution or government. You've got to inform it by looking outside in, by seeing what other people think of you. It doesn't at all matter, I'm afraid, what you think of yourself. It is other people's judgment of you that defines this. And Christian, we've been talking a little bit over the last couple of weeks around these new websites that are springing up on social media, things like didtheyhelp.com and Heroes and Zeros and Violation Tracker. These are all portals where institutions and governments even are held to account by public opinion, saying, actually, we're not okay with that. We're not okay that a certain corporate boss is going to government asking for a bailout when that boss has also been sort of trumpeting their virtue online about how well they're looking after employees, even as they're furloughing them. People are, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but it is a thing, that people are much more willing to step up and be judgmental when they see external pressure, as with COVID, forcing people to make clear moral judgments and take a stand on, do I support my workforce? Do I guarantee jobs and pay, even though that might severely stretch my lines of credit? And people are very willing to give credit where they see, good stepping up behaviour. So I'm thinking of, I don't really want to name brands, but you have to an extent. Some of the supermarkets, like, Tesco, have been putting social distancing guidelines on the ground, a really good piece of physical risk perception management. You've seen, Love Them or Loathe Them, the BBC, I think, have very much stepped up and, recaptured that role of the nation's public information source. You've seen, let's take a high street one, Timpson, the cobbler, the bosses of Timpson saying they're guaranteeing all of their staff salaries throughout COVID. And that's a kind of double win for Timpson because they are already the nation's top hirer of ex-offenders. They take former people who've been in the prison system and retrain them and give them a trade and a social outlook and skill set, which enables them to go back into society. I think it's absolutely brilliant. They're already in a really good starting position to say we're rising to the social challenge of COVID by making our staff feel even more comfortable. And by the way, that's costing them a lot of money to do that. So that's quite a moral test of your balance sheet to take that sort of stance. Christian, any other sort of examples that we've been coming across?
So I mean, I'm struck as well. You talk there about firms changing practices, and whether that's repurposing your factory or changing the way you pay people. I think we've also seen people just who do things that are useful, just doubling down on those efforts. There's a lovely example in the US, the name of which escapes me, where they make chemicals that are used in personal protective equipment. So the sorts of things that go into shields and masks. And these people decided that they were going to live in their factory for a month and produce this stuff 24 hours a day. And they didn't go home to allow them to not have to test themselves, not have to worry about that. And so they isolated themselves and just continued working through. And this was done with the agreement of the trade unions. And so I think there's an example of a company not doing anything different than it would do ordinarily, but I think shifting its approach and just recognizing the part that they have to play in that broader piece. And so I think we tend to focus on people that are doing things that are unusual, so stepping outside the normal bounds. But I think there's a heck of a lot of room here for people to just do what they do normally, recognizing the importance of particular aspects of that, within the sort of collective response to this situation. And I think, to come back to the Greg's original question around principles versus regulation, what I think this clearly demonstrates is that firstly, I think it would be impossible to to codify all of this stuff, because one, you would be codifying for a view in time, and that would constantly be changing. The second thing is, I think practice shifts our perceptions, as Roger's pointed out. So if one supermarket behaves in a certain manner, there is a natural expectation that everybody else could do the same thing and ought to follow suit. And so you're being compared not only to what people think is the right thing, but what they see going on around them and what they see other people are capable of doing. And even where that comparison isn't necessarily fair, because maybe you're doing some things that are invisible, people will focus on the things that they can see and the things they can interpret. And so this becomes a really interesting dynamic to manage that I think shifts firms away from a need to look at what the regulation says and really to think for themselves. And I think that can be quite uncomfortable ground for many organizations if their whole game has been, we will do what we have to do to comply with the rules, and that becomes our guideline. At the moment, in the kind of conduct space, those rules are falling out of the window and are no longer relevant. So you might be legal and you might be fitting within the you might be compliant, but you're not passing the broader conduct test. And so I think this interesting question about rules versus principles versus rules actually has a further dynamic, which is that the underlying is shifting, and the ground is shifting very, very quickly in ways that are not within the gift of the, we're not the gift of the regulator or indeed the regulatees.
Sorry to interrupt. If you'd like to put me on video, I think I can join you now.
Excellent. We will see if we can bring Roger into the room. Hopefully I can find him. I can, and I can allow him to talk. And even more, I may even be able to bring him in on video. I would. Here we are. Talking permitted. Let me see. Roger, promote to panelist. This should give you authorization to appear visually, and then people can not have to look at my visage. There we go. I've put a request in for you to appear on video, Roger. There we are. Excellent. Welcome, belatedly. You will notice, ladies and gentlemen, two separate approaches to COVID conduct. Roger has gone for the haircut. I have gone for the COVID look of letting mine grow out. That's the way that you can tell us apart if you were struggling to do so.
How lovely to see you. So I'm going to just put my phone off on the hope that we can carry on in full video. Worst case, I will come back on the phone line later if we get stuck.
One of the other things that I have noted people have been doing is judging celebrities and others by their bookshelves. I'm delighted to report that it's sort of difficult to see many of the books that you have there, but we will assume that they're all worthwhile tomes. If anybody spots anything untoward in the background, please do feel free to point that out as part of the spirit of the exercise.
You're very welcome to critique my reading matter. This is, I have to say, not my main working room. This is just where I've pulled a few volumes that I'm using to write the book I'm writing on culture audit at the moment, which you know all about, but we're not going to talk about that in detail today because it's a little bit rarefied for a broader audience. So, Christian, thank you. Where are we in terms of rhetorical questions?
So I think we've sort of dealt with the idea of why conduct is important. We have explored the dynamics under COVID. I think we spoke notably about people that are doing the right thing. And I wonder if you've got any so we've talked about supermarkets doing that thing. Should we look at the opposite end of the spectrum and just say to ourselves, what does bad conduct look like in the current environment?
Sure. So I was talking to my friend Bill Derodi, who you've probably seen on the correspondence, about people's behaviour during wartime. So Bill is a behavioural researcher and social historian who is doing some quite interesting parallels between what's going on now with COVID and what went on in the 1940s when we were all being bombed. And he makes a number of points. First of all, that this idea of the kind of the wartime spirit, that people are kind of spontaneously generous and helpful, not entirely true. In fact, there was a lot of criticism at the time that the government was kind of hanging out the public to dry, rather as there is now. People are wanting to do the right thing and support government process and obviously support the NHS. but there's still a kind of ripple of, well, hang on a minute, really, is the science as good as we're being told it is? And are we just being required to kind of suppress our own criticism of government in order, for the greater good, just to kind of go with doing as we're told? There's another, though, much darker subset of people for whom it's not just a kind of polite skepticism, it's actually looking to take advantage. So just as during the Second World War there was a black market in consumer goods, so we're now seeing a market in cybercrime, which sadly is exploding as more people are working from home with less good security controls. And there are, I'm sorry to say, and over on the briefing channel I get from the security people, we are seeing an awful lot of criminal opportunists. Some of it is very simple, kind of old-fashioned black market physical crime. So there was a bunch of guys who got in their vans and went around cleaning out the toilet roll supplies in all the local supermarkets and then sticking it online and selling it for inflated prices. So that's just straightforward, creating the margin. There's another rather more sinister group of people who are faking the identity of HMRC and posting alleged messages from HMRC to people's private emails saying, if you want to claim your tax benefit or your business loan for COVID, just get, the classic thing, give us your bank details and we'll give you some money. And hopefully most people wouldn't fall for that. A stranger, even if it says it's HMRC, saying, give us your bank details, you'd expect to kind of ring alarm bells with people. But everyone is in a sort of heightened state of anxiety and what looks like a helping hand being extended to them, a classic con trick, of course, pretending to give someone a helping hand and actually doing the exact opposite.
And there's something very interesting in...
So the bad behaviours do come to the fore at times of national stress.
And there's something interesting in what you just said in terms of both sides of it, because actually, as the game changes and perceptions change, things that might not matter in ordinary circumstances suddenly do. And I'm struck, for example, by your comment around people, the sort of the hoarders of toilet rolls who were trying to make a killing online. Yes. Well, you could historically, if you were Amazon or eBay or any of these other platforms, take a position to say, we don't interfere with pricing. We're a neutral platform that allows people to supply to meet demand. Now, clearly in a situation where you've got people using those platforms to be able to market these hoarded items at a premium product, suddenly an ordinary business decision, which is just that we would, and actually probably the right business decision in many respects, to say we will just allow market forces to operate and we're not going to interfere, actually becomes an interesting conduct issue where you'd say, well, why didn't you interfere?
Well, do you know what that behaviour is? It's bystanding. It's exactly what we were just talking about. So, to my mind, for the social media platforms simply to stand back and say, we are just publishers, we are ethically neutral platforms, is no longer tenable. You cannot say, as Facebook or as Amazon or eBay or whoever, we will just stand back and let the cash roll through the system. It's sort of tantamount to condoning criminality. And I'm conscious that some of the platforms are getting a lot better at this now. Others, I think, are still dragging their feet. And my sense of the whole COVID experience is there is going to be a big reckoning of what I call social license at the end of this. Social license, just to kind of translate, is the extent to which people are willing to let a business go on doing what it's doing without criticizing it. Off you go. So, and an easy thing with social license is electing a government. So when you elect a government, okay, not everybody votes for whoever ends up in power, but the basic deal with the government is after you've finished voting, the voters just want the government to get the hell on with the job. Go away, do your work, do things as best you can. The deal is we trust you to get on with running things. And in the same way with the brand, I bought such and such a brand of clothes or car or whatever. I want it just to kind of do the job that I bought it to do. I want my work suit to look okay. I want my car to work when I turn on the ignition. If it lets me down, or if the manufacturer kind of gets back to any naughty stuff, as VW did with the emissions scandal, people start thinking, I'm actually not sure I want to be associating my purchase choices with someone who's behaving like that. And I think this kind of social reckoning, this kind of reappraisal of social license, there's going to be a real kind of big time, social balance sheet, if you like, that's going to come back at the end of COVID when people look back, rather as our friend Pooj is doing with his website, to say who was really helpful, who actually stepped up and helped, and who didn't, who was exploitative or manipulative of the market, or was actually just stand back being a bystander hoping it would all go away and not stepping up and sort of reassessing their own engagement with people. So I think an awful lot of that. The other big question which we have to float, because we're kind of responsible analysts here, of course, is the politics of all this. And I'm not going to make part of political points. I think, as I said about voters, whatever the outcome of the vote, you want to trust the government. They're going to try and do the best thing for us. That's what they're there for. But there is a big debate thrashing around below the surface, which is the politics of costing human life. And it is not true. It is disingenuous, frankly, to say that the politics is simply following the science. That's not the way it's supposed to work. Science provides the data, in this case on epidemiology, to an extent, collateral risks like what we've been hearing about, like domestic violence and public disorder and so on. The job of the politicians is to look at all that and take a moral decision as to what the best balance of cost is versus lives lost versus destruction of the economy or whatever. It is not the job of the politicians to stand, as it were, behind the scientists and say, look, it's just the science. It's not just the science. And this again is around social contract, good conduct, engagement, stepping up, not just standing back. And I have some concern. I'm not saying this is necessarily a strong view at the moment, but the longer lockdown goes on, the more those voices are going to say, it's not just about the epidemiology or the throughput rate of the Nightingale or whatever. It's actually about, at some point as a politician, you have to say, look, we understand inevitably more people are going to die. Meanwhile, these other people who perhaps didn't need to die, I'm really interested in talking to some doctor friends, how many people are self-excluding from the health system and not presenting with illnesses now because they're nervous about being told to stay at home? But one of the analyses is there's going to be a big spike in non-COVID hospital treatments in about 6 months' time, when people who put off their cancer scan or their blood work or whatever are going to find that actually underlying problems that they had have been exacerbated during the wait for treatment, and that you're going to have a spike in sort of unnatural deaths or early deaths because of people who were withholding because they were, as they saw it, doing the social responsible things, staying at home during lockdown. And this is what the politics is supposed to be about. It's including the broad view of the collateral damage, not just fixating on one sort of primary cause of crisis. I'm sorry that's a little technical risk stuff, but that's what we're supposed to be doing in behaviour analysis. These are not simple binaries.
There's a couple of things that occurred to me as you were talking. The first one of which is to say that when we think about conduct in the current environment, of course, that is not just an organisational piece. That is down to each one of us individually and how we respond to those government pieces. And I think if viewers / listeners are interested in sort of thinking about, well, what does conduct mean? It is worth reflecting on how we're all behaving ourselves and what we are doing, and whether are we doing things, are we avoiding doing things that are visible and yet invisibly breaking the rules? Are we complying with the spirit of the law of the letter? And perhaps the laws actually themselves haven't been that well codified. So we've seen lots of, particularly here in the UK, where there's been a shift, where they have recognized that message A actually was unhelpful. And so a good example would be, as you say, people not going to hospital because they were told to stay at home. That translated into people actually doing the wrong thing, which is not coming forward. Now, partly there's nothing you can do about that, because the last place a lot of people want to go at the moment is a center of infection, which is hospitals, but actually they're avoiding going for other reasons. So how do you codify that? And this goes back to, I think, Greg's question around can you codify conduct in rules? And I think there are some things you absolutely can. Speed limits would be a good example. Now, speed limits will never be entirely correct for everybody, but societally they sort of work. But there are other things where you can't necessarily.
Let me play devil's advocate then, because this is interesting. We see big generational changes in things like drink driving, seatbelt wearing, antisocial behaviour orders, and there are really significant bits of social progress which have been the result of long-term kind of generational changes. But now let's take a really difficult, controversial one this morning, which is smoking. Now, we know the primary evidence is that smoking is related to all sorts of forms of cancer and other things like heart disease. And yet there's a French study out this week, which many of you on this group will have seen because we're interested in risk stuff, which shows that nicotine apparently may be a preventative to COVID-19. And that there's a clear statistical correlation in the Chinese experience, give or take some issues with the source data, that actually you would expect to see more smokers in hospital with COVID-19 than have actually presented. And that smokers are, I won't quote the percentages because I don't want to muddy the waters, but significantly, as they say, underrepresented. So here we have a real dilemma because smoking clearly is not a healthy activity on one score, and yet would appear to be a sort of silver bullet, nicotine protection versus this particular virus. Now, it's very early days, and please don't all rush off and, do the toilet roll thing with your local tobacconists, because that's not going to help. But there's clearly a situation in which a piece of newly discovered science clashes with the former advice, and just because no one is saying you should take up smoking and that will make your life better. That's not the case. But there's clearly a much more complex trade-off between something which over the matter of a generation had become seen as an antisocial activity and actually these unexpected other benefits. Rather like using the various kind of retroviral drugs that were developed for AIDS and SARS and some of the other epidemics, are now being retested and reused and repurposed as potential solutions for COVID. We're discovering that there are bits of the risk landscape which we kind of neglected, and we now need to kind of repurpose and rethink. The smoking thing is fascinating to me because it clearly flies in the face of all medical advice, for a generation. And yet there might be something in it. So how do you reframe that in a way that sort of rebalances the debate? I don't know. Early days, but it's fascinating.
And there's something interesting in all of the things that you've said. The only way, in many cases, we will know whether these things work or not, or whether decisions that were made, messages that were communicated, perceptions at the time were right, is, of course, with the benefit of hindsight. So we will know later on, we can't with certainty say now which governments have got this right in terms of their lockdown processes. We think we know based on the evidence that we have so far, but we can't say for sure. And I think there's something interesting around the conduct piece where we've talked about it being a movable feast. But actually what is going to happen is that there's going to be judgments around this in the long term that won't necessarily reflect the dynamics of the short term. We'll forget the limited information that was available, the experience that was had at the time, and we will judge things, and we will judge conduct in particular based on a presumption about what it was like afterwards.
One of the biggest issues with hindsight bias is medical negligence cases. Now, think about it. If somebody dies at the hands of a surgeon, the cause of death is evident with hindsight. And therefore, when the case goes to court for clinical negligence, the evidence, as it were, against the surgeon is 100% clear with the lens of hindsight. But clearly, none of us would believe the surgeon would willingly want the person to die. That's not, it's clearly against the Hippocratic Oath. It's against all their risk practices. The surgeon constantly has to take the risk that they're making the right decision given uncertain information, given that we don't know everything. The likely best course of action is to operate in a certain way in order to have the best chance of saving the patient's life. It failed, and then the negligence case is brought with the benefit of hindsight. Now looking at conduct, the holy grail really for behavioural regulators is to be able to get MI, to get information sets, measurement sets, for what is acceptable and expected behaviour. But what to me is so interesting is the boundaries of what is acceptable and expected are shifting during COVID. If you'd said to anyone 6 months ago, you're going to have to lock yourself in your house for 6 weeks, everyone would say, what the hell? No chance. What possible situation could there be in which that would be the right thing to do? So clearly people at a personal level have learned to adjust their own expectations. And because of that, quite reasonably, as they sit at home doing whatever people are doing at home for 6 weeks, because they've had to adjust their own expectation set, they are then kind of reflecting outwards. So hang on a minute, if this is different, fundamentally different, what else is fundamentally different? And, how does that affect my relations with most obviously the food supply, my financial arrangements, the rest of my family. Again, this is a little provocative, but those people who are distant friends who actually I don't really care about very much, and so I'm not, I haven't stayed in touch with them, versus my close family who I'm using the opportunity to get back in touch with, So there are these sort of social reevaluate. That's a flippant example, but you see where I'm going with this. People are reevaluating their relationships, not just the supply chain, as it were, but with their own sort of social circle and their families. They're making much social judgments about, okay, so my bank basically closed the branch and there's been no cash in the ATM for a couple of weeks. And what does that say about, how does that stack up against their claim? The gap between their claim that we're here to help and they're actually not when I need them. One definition of a bank from years ago is that they're there to help you when you have a particular need, whether it's some big life stage like getting married or buying a house or whatever, or you're setting up a business and you need a bit, more of a hand to kind of carry the debt while the business builds up. By that definition, that's supposed to be what the business of banking is about. It's kind of supporting people to live their lives and have aspirations and grow stuff. And, and if, as the old saying goes, the bank manager kind of lends you the umbrella, but then takes it away when it starts to rain. If people are observing that was the deal and that we're not okay with that, then I think there's going to be a lot of critique. By the way, the behavioural regulator, or at least the current incumbent, Chris Woolard, was saying just last week, and I quote, there's a real recognition that the current crisis with COVID is a chance to get things right compared with the past. So let's just be really clear what the conduct regulator is saying. He's saying we had a banking crisis, we had the global financial crash in 2008. Not everybody stepped up at that point, even given the new regulation that followed, which was very behaviour focused, all about the people. Now, in a sense, we're getting a second chance to say we've rediscovered our moral courage. And we're going to collectively, as a sector, step up and use this, as Barack Obama said, don't waste a good crisis. This crisis is a good opportunity to show that we have social engagement, not just in banking, obviously, everyone else, all the other providers as well. And indeed, those businesses who've been really badly hit because they're based on being sociable. I'm thinking particularly of kind of restaurants and the food industry, of, really struggling, actually. What do you do if your business is creating social spaces, but nobody's allowed to socialize in social spaces? That's a real challenge. So hindsight, yes, but actually it's more about looking for the moving target. And I think the big deal right now is that the target is moving quite quickly away from the old kind of shareholder model of business where it's all about capital ownership and returns to shareholders. Much more now, and this is part of a bigger debate that started last year or earlier even, about balancing all the stakeholders. So not just the capital, but the workforce, the social provision, the thing it is that you do that's useful. And by the way, the conduct regulator in finance has started asking these questions, literally walking around, bank branches and dealing rooms and trading floors and saying, tell me a bit about what you do that is purposeful. What do you achieve here other than earning money for yourself and your boss? How do you make the world a better place? If this bank were to pack up and go out of business tomorrow, would anyone mourn them? Think of it as the Scrooge test. What did you do while you were alive? What did you return to the wider society? And one or two banks, interestingly, Japan, which has had conduct regulation for 15 years longer than we've had in the UK, but who knew? They are way more focused on social contribution, the idea that you're achieving something not simply as a return to the balance sheet, but actually helping cash to pump through the economy is the function of banking, not just simply self-reward. And there are a couple of Japanese banks I've worked with who are really, really good at capturing metrics on this idea of, wider purpose. How do you pay back? What do you do that's not just your day-to-day job, but that shows that you're engaged with regulatory process, returns to society, being a good employer, and all these other kinds of indicators. That's great work that's going on there already.
And of course, this is quite challenging for organizations because if I think about interactions that one might have with whatever kind of company, there are going to be things that stepping up to the plate, whatever that means, requires them to step outside what they would normally have done. That doesn't require you, for example, to manage your relationship with your customer by what it says in the contract. because although that's legally appropriate, effectively, I can think of a good example where a subscription service I have where I'm required to, it's for fizzy bottles of water, so I'm required to return my gas canisters every 30 days. I cannot physically do that because the place I need to get to would put me in danger going there and would be irresponsible for me to do that. But technically, they could fine me for not returning this thing. So I got in touch with them and said...
Some person there saying, Christian, you're in breach. You're not bringing your gas bottles back. Yeah.
And so I think there's a really interesting example that the processes that they put in place.
Here's what I've been wondering about. My car is due its MOT, but you can't get to an MOT testing station at the moment because they're closed, a lot of them. Does that mean that I'm a bad person because I haven't had my car tested?
Well, the good news for you, Roger, is that they've extended that, but you've got a 3-month leeway that's automatically been granted to you. But it's interesting that hasn't been communicated clearly. But I think that is a really good example.
Well, maybe I just wasn't paying attention. But I mean, another example, my local council, for example, have kept on all the traffic wardens, and they're ticketing like crazy as people leave their cars on yellow lines during lockdown, sort of assuming it's okay. And the message from their point of view is, this is great. This is extra revenue for the council, from exploiting people's disadvantage. It seems to me.
But there's a really interesting point though, which is around the shifted paradigm, because from a conduct perspective, you've also got an approach that says, normal rules do not apply. And so I think we will also, as well as people going beyond the call of contract and beyond the call of duty in a positive sense, you will also, your example of people, why is it okay to suddenly start parking your car in a place that you couldn't ordinarily park it? Now, there might be a really good reason why you're doing it.
I'm sure that's how the council sees it. It's not okay to flout the rules because...
right. And I think the challenge for people within organizations is to work out, how do you communicate to your workforce where is it an appropriate game change? Where are we doing the right thing and breaking our traditional policies and procedures? And where is it absolutely that we shouldn't? And that might not be predictable.
Well, let me kind of conclude-ish with a couple of thoughts from the regulator again. This is the conduct regulator. So just to be clear, conduct regulation equals how you behave. It's not about the commercial contracted law or the value at risk. It's about how the people work with other people. And the real test, it's a bit of a cliche, but actually the whole conduct conversation is bringing us in this direction. It's no longer about sort of talking the talk and having corporate mission statements and values, plaques on the wall with a bunch of here's our principles and purpose. It's very much what I call the what actually happens test, or as they say across the board, how do you walk the talk? And I think a lot of corporates saw the conduct challenge initially as being kind of publishing a manifesto for, no, we're serious about talking about how we behave here, which is great. They should be having those conversations, and I'd encourage them to, and I do encourage them to, working directly with them. But actually, it's not about the conversation. It's about moving on and then doing the thing. And the extent to which people are spontaneously saying, yeah, we know what good luck. The average employee in any organization, particularly at a junior level, absolutely has an innate ethical sense of what good behavior looks like. But very often that is squashed out of them by the kind of clumsy controls or the kind of social climate of working in the place, the culture of working in the place. So the conduct challenge to business is get past these cultures of just sort of sell stuff regardless of the consequence and tune back into that conscience, which most of your workforce would like to bring in through the door, but very often they kind of hang up with their coat as they arrive at the door, and then kind of suppress that little voice of conscience that says, actually, this is not okay. And I think the COVID experience has, for a lot of people, been a pause for thought and distance, literally distance and reflection of actually, how can I reintroduce my conscience into the workplace and really make that a day-to-day thing? How can we start doing what the regulator calls exemplary behavior rather than just compliant behavior? Not doing it because we're told to, but doing it because we take a pride in doing it. And I think you've already seen examples of firms that have applied that thinking and are stepping up and doing it. Maybe it's in their DNA. Maybe there's nothing like a good crisis to make them reappraise their behaviour and come right. Others haven't got it and probably won't ever get it. And I think we're all much more focused on that.
I think that's a great note on which to finish. Roger, thank you so much. Thank you to those of you that are able to join. We will share details of the recording. I'll work out where the video makes sense with my face for most of it, but thank you for those of you that are able to join us. If you want to contact either of us, you have our contact details in the invite. Please do. Happy to continue this conversation. Hope you found it useful. Feedback, do let us know. Otherwise, only thing remains to say is remember to wash your hands and stay safe. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening to the recording of our webinar. If conduct is of further interest, then you'll be able to hear my original interview with Roger in episode 6 of this series. Further human risk webinars are being planned. Details of those will be released in the Human Risk newsletter and on my social media feeds. If you're not already subscribed, you'll find the Human Risk podcast wherever you get your quality audio content. Thanks again for listening, and stay tuned for another episode coming very soon.